"She's just a burden now," Emily said, her voice low but clear enough for Margaret Whitmore to hear from the other side of the bank counter. The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and unexpected, like a door quietly closing. Margaret didn't react. She simply folded the receipt the teller had just handed her and placed it carefully into her purse, the same brown leather purse she had carried for nearly 15 years. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected off the parked cars along Main Street, and the small town branch of Lakeview Community Bank looked exactly the same as it had for decades. To anyone passing by, it was an ordinary Tuesday. But for Margaret, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. She had just transferred $180,000 to her son Jason and his wife Emily. It was every dollar she had carefully saved since her husband Robert passed away 9 years earlier. 32 years of working as an office accountant. Weekend bookkeeping jobs during tax season. Quiet evenings balancing numbers at the kitchen table while Robert watched baseball in the living room. All of it had led to that account. Margaret had never thought of the money as wealth. To her, it was security. It was the promise that she would never have to depend on anyone. Yet when Jason called 3 weeks earlier, his voice heavy with stress about the mortgage on the new house outside Naperville, she didn't hesitate for long. A mother rarely does. He had explained that the adjustable rate had jumped, that daycare for their daughter Lily was more expensive than expected, that things would stabilize soon if they could just breathe for a few months. Margaret listened quietly. She could picture him pacing in his kitchen while he spoke. She had raised him alone for several years when Robert worked double shifts at the steel plant, and even now she could hear the same nervous tone he had as a boy when asking permission for something he was afraid might be too much. Emily had joined the call halfway through. Her voice was polite, careful, almost overly warm. She thanked Margaret several times for even considering helping. She said family should support one another. She said Margaret had always been so generous. Those words had sounded sincere at the time. Margaret believed them enough to drive to the bank that morning. The transfer itself took less than 10 minutes. The teller printed the paperwork. Margaret signed her name slowly on the line, and the numbers moved from one account to another with the quiet efficiency of modern banking. Jason stood beside her looking relieved. Emily scrolled on her phone, occasionally glancing up with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then the transaction finished. The teller wished them a nice day. Margaret closed her purse. And just before they walked toward the door, Emily leaned slightly toward Jason and whispered the sentence she clearly thought Margaret wouldn't hear. "She's just becoming a burden." Margaret paused for half a second, not long enough for anyone to notice. Then she continued walking. Outside, a cool breeze moved through the trees lining the parking lot. Jason was already talking about repainting the living room in their new house, and how much easier things would be now that the financial pressure was gone. Emily unlocked the car and laughed lightly at something on her phone. Margaret stood there beside them, smiling politely, listening to the plans they were making with the money she had spent a lifetime earning. And for the first time since Robert died, Margaret Whitmore felt something settle quietly in her mind. Not anger, not sadness, just a clear, steady understanding that some words, once spoken, reveal far more than the person who said them ever intended. Margaret Whitmore drove home from the bank with both hands steady on the steering wheel, the quiet roads of suburban Illinois passing slowly outside her windshield as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the lawns and sidewalks of the neighborhood she had lived in for more than 20 years. Nothing around her looked different. The same maple trees lined the streets. The same mailboxes stood beside tidy driveways. A neighbor walked a golden retriever past the corner house, where children often played basketball on weekends. It was the kind of calm place people imagined when they thought of stability. Yet Margaret noticed that her mind had become unusually still. The sentence she had overheard at the bank continued to echo softly in the back of her thoughts, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet clarity that made it impossible to ignore. She did not feel the urge to call Jason. She did not feel the need to defend herself or ask Emily what she meant. Instead, she simply drove the familiar route home, turned into her driveway, and parked beside the small white garage that Robert had painted himself one summer long ago. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The porch swing moved slightly in the breeze. The curtains in the living room window shifted gently as the air conditioning hummed inside. Margaret unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet interior where the scent of furniture polish and old books lingered in the air. For a moment she stood in the entryway and listened. The house had been silent like this for years, but today the silence felt different. Not lonely, just observant. She placed her purse on the small wooden table near the door and walked slowly into the kitchen. The clock above the refrigerator read 4:30 in the afternoon. Margaret filled a kettle with water, placed it on the stove, and waited for it to heat. She had followed this same routine for decades. Tea in the afternoon, sometimes with a biscuit if she had baked that week. Today she simply watched the kettle as it warmed. As the soft sound of heating water filled the room, Margaret's thoughts drifted through small memories that now seemed more meaningful than they once had. She remembered Emily's polite smiles during holidays. The way Emily always spoke warmly when Jason was nearby, but grew noticeably quieter when they were alone together in the kitchen. Margaret remembered a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier when Emily had suggested that older people should simplify their lives and avoid becoming dependent on family. At the time, Margaret had nodded politely and passed the gravy bowl. She remembered Christmas morning last year when Emily laughed about retirement communities in Arizona and joked that they looked like vacation resorts for grandparents. None of those moments had seemed important before. Each one had been small, harmless even. But now, sitting alone in her kitchen with the kettle beginning to whistle softly, Margaret realized that small moments often revealed far more truth than dramatic ones. She poured the hot water into her favorite blue mug and carried it into the living room where Robert's old armchair still faced the television. The evening news had not started yet. The house remained calm and quiet. Margaret sat down, slowly, holding the warm mug between her hands, and looked around the room where so many years of her life had passed. The photographs on the shelves showed Jason at different ages. School pictures, baseball uniforms, college graduation, his wedding day with Emily standing beside him in a white dress and a confident smile. Margaret studied that photograph for a long moment. Then she set the mug down carefully on the coffee table. Something inside her had begun to arrange itself into a clear and steady understanding. Not an emotional reaction, not a sudden plan, just the calm awareness that when people finally show you how they see you, the wisest response is not argument. The wisest response is observation. And Margaret Whitmore had always been very good at observing. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm Midwestern morning that Margaret Whitmore had known for most of her life. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains as the clock in her bedroom reached 7 o'clock, and the familiar rhythm of the house slowly came to life around her. Margaret rose from bed without rushing. She had never liked beginning the day in a hurry. In the kitchen, she prepared breakfast the same way she had for years: 2 slices of toast, a small bowl of oatmeal, and a cup of black coffee. Outside the window, a delivery truck moved down the street, leaving packages on doorsteps, while a school bus stopped at the corner to collect children wrapped in heavy backpacks. The neighborhood followed its usual routine, but Margaret's thoughts continued to move carefully through the memories that had surfaced the evening before. She no longer focused on the words she had overheard at the bank. Instead, she began paying attention to a larger pattern that had been forming quietly over time. After breakfast, she carried her coffee to the small desk in the living room where she kept her household papers neatly organized in labeled folders. Margaret had always believed that order made life easier to understand. Utility bills were stacked in one tray. Insurance documents were placed in another. Bank statements rested in a long envelope arranged by month. She opened the envelope and looked through the most recent statements from her savings account. The numbers were simple now. The large balance that had taken decades to build had been transferred only yesterday. Margaret did not stare at the missing digits with regret. Instead, she studied the date and the confirmation details printed on the page. The transaction was clear and official, recorded exactly as the bank required. She placed the document back into its folder and sat quietly for a moment. The house remained peaceful. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower started in the distance. Margaret reached for another folder, this one older and thicker than the rest. Inside were records that Robert had always insisted on keeping. Mortgage papers from years ago, tax returns, and notes from meetings with the family attorney who had helped them write their estate plan shortly before Robert became ill. Margaret flipped through the pages slowly. She could still remember Robert's voice explaining why careful planning mattered. He had believed that money was never only about comfort. It was about independence. It was about ensuring that no one could quietly take advantage of someone who had spent a lifetime building stability. At the time, Margaret had listened patiently while Robert discussed legal language and responsibilities. Now those conversations returned with a new sense of clarity. Around 10:30 in the morning, Margaret's phone vibrated gently on the desk. A message appeared from Jason. He thanked her again for the help and said that things already felt less stressful at home. Emily had added a short message as well, writing that they were excited about the improvements they planned to make to the house once everything settled down. Margaret read both messages carefully. She noticed how quickly the conversation had moved from gratitude to future plans. She set the phone down without replying immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked toward the living room window where sunlight now filled the yard. The maple tree Robert planted years earlier cast a long shadow across the grass. Margaret watched the quiet street for several minutes and allowed herself to think calmly about everything she had seen and heard during the past day. A quiet realization continued to grow stronger in her mind. People often reveal their true beliefs not when they are struggling, but when they believe the problem has already been solved. And in Jason and Emily's minds, the problem had been solved yesterday inside that small bank office. Margaret Whitmore understood something now that she had not fully accepted before. The money she had given away was not the most important thing she had lost. What mattered far more was the clear view she had gained of how easily some people could confuse generosity with weakness. And Margaret had never been a weak woman. That afternoon, Margaret Whitmore drove to the grocery store the same way she had done nearly every Wednesday for the past 15 years, turning slowly onto Maple Avenue and passing the same row of small businesses that had been part of the town long before Jason was born. The sky above Illinois was a pale blue, the kind that made everything feel ordinary and predictable. Yet Margaret noticed how clearly her thoughts had begun to organize themselves since the quiet morning she had spent reviewing her papers. Inside the grocery store, the cool air carried the familiar scent of fresh bread and coffee from the small bakery near the entrance. Margaret took a shopping cart and moved through the aisles with her usual calm pace, placing items into the basket with careful attention. A carton of milk, a loaf of wheat bread, a bag of apples. She did not need much these days. Living alone meant the refrigerator rarely filled the way it once had when Jason was a teenager who could finish an entire pizza by himself after baseball practice. Those memories came to her gently as she walked past the frozen food section. She remembered late evenings waiting for Jason to come home, the sound of the front door opening, the way he would drop his sports bag in the hallway and call out that he was starving. Margaret had worked long hours in those years, but she never regretted it. Every paycheck had been a step toward giving her son a stable life. At the checkout counter, the young cashier greeted her politely and asked if she found everything she needed. Margaret smiled and answered yes, her voice calm and steady. She paid for the groceries and carried the bags to her car, placing them carefully in the back seat. As she closed the door, her phone vibrated again. This time it was not a message, but a photograph that Emily had posted online. Margaret did not usually spend much time on social media, but the image appeared clearly on the screen. Jason and Emily were standing in front of a car dealership, smiling widely beside a shiny dark blue vehicle that reflected the afternoon sunlight. The caption beneath the photo read that they were celebrating a new beginning and finally upgrading their life after a stressful few months. Margaret looked at the picture for several seconds without changing her expression. The car behind them was unmistakable. Even someone who did not follow automobiles could recognize the silver letters on the front grille of a new BMW sport utility vehicle. Margaret gently locked her phone and placed it back into her purse. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, hands resting quietly on the steering wheel while the parking lot buzzed with the ordinary movement of shoppers and carts rolling across the pavement. A younger woman nearby laughed while loading groceries into her trunk. A man pushed a cart toward the store entrance. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet Margaret understood something with absolute certainty now. The help she had given had already begun to transform into something else in Jason and Emily's world. What they called relief had quickly become celebration. What they called gratitude had quietly become expectation. Margaret started the engine and drove home through the same calm streets she had known for decades. The maple trees cast long shadows across the pavement as the afternoon moved toward evening. Inside her mind, a quiet decision was forming. not driven by anger, but by the steady logic that had guided her entire career as an accountant. Numbers always told the truth when people did not. And Margaret Whitmore had spent a lifetime learning how to read numbers carefully. That evening, Margaret Whitmore placed the groceries neatly into her refrigerator and cabinets, following the quiet order that had always made her home feel calm and predictable. The house settled into its usual stillness as dusk slowly arrived outside the windows. A soft orange glow spread across the neighborhood lawns while porch lights flickered on one by one along the street. Margaret moved through her evening routine without rushing. She washed a few dishes, folded a small stack of laundry, and then returned to the desk in the living room where her folders still rested exactly as she had left them earlier that morning. For a moment, she simply looked at the papers without touching them. The photograph she had seen of Jason and Emily beside the new vehicle remained clear in her mind. The bright smiles, the confident posture, the caption announcing a new beginning. Margaret did not feel offended by the purchase itself. People were free to spend their money as they wished. What held her attention was the speed with which the situation had changed. Only a few weeks earlier, Jason had sounded overwhelmed by the mortgage payment on their house. Now the problem seemed distant enough to celebrate with a luxury vehicle that easily cost more than $60,000. Margaret had spent her entire adult life working with numbers, and numbers rarely allowed confusion to survive for long. She opened the drawer of the desk and removed a yellow legal pad along with a simple pen. Sitting down in Robert's old chair, she began writing quietly. First, she noted the exact amount that had been transferred at the bank, $180,000. Next, she wrote the date and the account information exactly as it appeared on the bank confirmation. Then she began listing the conversations that had led to the decision. The phone call 3 weeks earlier. Jason explaining that they needed temporary help to stabilize the mortgage payment. Emily expressing gratitude and assuring Margaret that the situation would improve once the immediate pressure eased. Margaret paused for a moment and rested the pen against the paper. She was not documenting these details out of suspicion. It was simply the habit of someone who had spent decades ensuring that every financial record remained clear and organized. Still, as she continued writing, another thought settled quietly into place. In every loan she had ever processed during her years as an accountant, there had always been one simple rule. Clarity protected everyone involved. When money moved between people without clear expectations, confusion often followed. Margaret finished her notes and placed the pen down beside the pad. The living room lamp cast a warm circle of light over the desk, while the rest of the house remained peacefully dim. Outside, the street had grown quiet except for the distant hum of a passing car. Margaret leaned back slightly in the chair and looked toward the framed photograph of Robert that stood on the bookshelf across the room. In the picture, he was standing beside the old maple tree they planted together during their first year in the house. He had always believed that careful preparation prevented unnecessary trouble later. Margaret reached for the telephone that rested beside the desk and scrolled calmly through her contact list. One name stood out immediately, a name that had been part of their lives for many years. David Collins. Robert had trusted him with every important legal document the family ever signed. Margaret studied the name for a few seconds before setting the phone back down on the desk without dialing yet. She was not in a hurry. Decisions made too quickly often overlooked important details. Instead, she folded the legal pad page neatly and placed it inside the folder containing her bank records. The quiet plan forming in her mind did not require anger or confrontation. It required patience, clarity, and the steady discipline she had practiced throughout her entire life. And Margaret Whitmore had always been very patient when the truth needed time to reveal itself. The following morning, Margaret Whitmore woke earlier than usual, the quiet house still wrapped in the soft gray light that comes just before sunrise in an Illinois suburb. For a few moments she remained in bed listening to the distant sound of a delivery truck moving somewhere along the main road, the world outside slowly preparing for another ordinary day. Margaret had always appreciated mornings like this. They offered space to think clearly before the distractions of daily life began. She rose, dressed carefully, and prepared coffee in the same small kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals over the years. The steady routine helped her mind focus. While the coffee brewed, she looked out the window at the maple tree Robert planted long ago. The leaves moved gently in the early breeze, and the street remained nearly empty except for a jogger passing by with headphones and a determined pace. Margaret poured her coffee and carried the cup to the desk in the living room where the folder containing her notes rested exactly where she had placed it the night before. She opened it again and reviewed the details she had written. The transfer amount, the date, the conversations that led to it. Everything remained clear and precise. That clarity brought her a quiet sense of control. Margaret reached for the telephone once more, and this time she dialed the number she had been considering since the previous evening. The call connected after only 2 rings. David Collins answered in the same calm voice Margaret remembered from years of meetings. At his office downtown. When he heard her name, his tone immediately warmed with familiarity. David had known Robert for more than 20 years, and he understood the careful way the Whitmore family handled important matters. Margaret explained that she would like to schedule a short meeting to review some financial questions. She did not rush through her explanation. Instead, she spoke with the same composed tone she had used throughout her professional life. David listened quietly and agreed to meet her later that afternoon. His office was only 15 minutes away near the courthouse square, a brick building that had housed legal practices in the town for decades. After ending the call, Margaret finished her coffee and prepared for the day. She selected a simple navy sweater and a light coat before stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The drive into town felt calm and familiar. Traffic moved steadily, but without urgency. When Margaret parked near the courthouse, she noticed the same stone steps and tall windows that had always made the area feel dependable and stable. David Collins greeted her personally when she entered the office, guiding her into a small conference room where sunlight streamed across the polished wooden table. They exchanged a few polite updates about the town and about Robert before Margaret placed the folder on the table and opened it carefully. She explained the situation without emotion. The transfer of money. The reason Jason had given for needing help. The purchase she had seen announced only days later. David did not interrupt while she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back slightly and considered the information with the thoughtful patience that had built his reputation over the years. Finally, he asked a simple question that seemed to carry more meaning than its calm delivery suggested. He asked Margaret whether the money had been clearly defined as a gift or whether the understanding between the family members had been less specific. Margaret paused for a moment and then answered honestly that no formal agreement had been written at the time. David nodded slowly, not surprised. Situations like this were more common than many people realized. But he also reminded her that conversations, expectations, and records often provided important context when questions later needed to be clarified. Margaret listened carefully as he outlined several possibilities that could protect her interests while keeping the situation respectful and lawful. The discussion lasted nearly an hour, and by the time Margaret stepped back into the afternoon sunlight outside the courthouse square, the quiet plan that had begun forming in her mind was no longer just an idea. It had become something organized, patient, and very real. Margaret Whitmore drove home from David Collins's office with the same steady composure she had carried through most difficult moments in her life, the quiet streets of the town stretching ahead while the late afternoon sun settled low over the courthouse square behind her. The meeting had not been dramatic. David had not raised his voice or suggested anything reckless. Instead, he had done what careful attorneys often do. He had simply explained how clarity in documentation could slowly change the direction of a situation that once seemed final. Margaret understood every word. For 32 years, she had worked with ledgers and financial records, and she knew that money rarely moved without leaving a trail that could be understood later. When she reached her neighborhood, the streets were calm as always. A few children rode bicycles along the sidewalk, while a neighbor watered the flower beds near his driveway. Margaret parked in front of her house and sat in the car for a moment before stepping out. The air carried the faint scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke from somewhere down the block. Inside the house, the same peaceful silence greeted her. She placed her purse on the small table near the door and returned to the living room where the folder of papers now felt less like a collection of worries and more like the beginning of a careful plan. Margaret did not rush. She brewed another cup of tea and sat beside the desk while the evening news played quietly in the background. Her mind moved calmly through the details David had discussed. Nothing required confrontation. Nothing required anger. The situation only required patience and clear communication. Later that evening her phone rang. Jason's name appeared on the screen. Margaret answered with the same warm tone she had always used when speaking with her son. Jason sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. He spoke about the new vehicle they had purchased and how much easier life felt now that their financial pressure had eased. Emily's voice occasionally drifted into the conversation in the background, laughing about errands and plans. For the weekend, Jason eventually mentioned that they were organizing a small housewarming dinner the following week and asked if Margaret would like to come see the improvements they were making to the property. Margaret listened carefully before answering that she would be happy to visit. Her voice remained calm and sincere. She had always enjoyed seeing Jason's home, especially when her granddaughter Lily ran through the living room showing off her newest toys. After the call ended, Margaret remained seated for several minutes holding the silent phone in her hand. The invitation confirmed something she had already suspected. Jason and Emily believed the situation was settled. In their minds, the chapter had closed the moment the transfer cleared at the bank. Margaret placed the phone gently on the desk and opened the folder again. Inside were the notes she had written, the bank confirmation, and the additional documents David had helped prepare earlier that afternoon. Each page had been organized with the same quiet precision Margaret had practiced throughout her career. The plan required only one more step. It would not create a scene. It would not humiliate anyone. It would simply clarify expectations that had been left unspoken. Margaret closed the folder and placed it carefully inside her purse. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on as the sky darkened over the neighborhood. Somewhere down the block a car door closed and laughter echoed briefly in the evening air. Margaret Whitmore leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The upcoming dinner at Jason's house would be pleasant, just as he expected. But by the time the evening ended, everyone at that table would understand something that had not been clear before. Margaret was generous. She had always been generous. But generosity and weakness were never the same thing. The evening of the housewarming dinner arrived with the calm warmth of early autumn, and Margaret Whitmore drove toward Jason and Emily's home just as the sun began lowering behind the rows of suburban rooftops. The neighborhood where they lived was newer than Margaret's own street, with larger houses, wide driveways, and carefully landscaped lawns that gave the area a polished appearance. As she turned onto their street, she noticed several cars already parked along the curb, suggesting that a few friends had been invited as well. Margaret parked slowly and stepped out of the car, smoothing the front of her coat before walking up the stone pathway toward the front door. The house looked bright and lively, lights spilling from the windows while music played softly somewhere inside. Jason opened the door almost immediately, greeting her with a wide smile and a warm embrace. He thanked her again for coming and led her into the living room where Emily stood near the kitchen island arranging glasses for the guests. Emily's smile appeared polished and confident, the same expression Margaret had seen many times before. She greeted Margaret warmly and spoke enthusiastically about how much easier life had become over the past few weeks. Margaret listened with a gentle smile while she removed her coat and took in the details of the room. The new furniture, the fresh paint on the walls. Through the window, she could even see the dark blue vehicle parked proudly in the driveway beneath the porch light. Guests moved comfortably through the house, while small conversations filled the air. Margaret greeted them politely, accepting a glass of iced tea while Jason described the renovations they were planning for the kitchen next spring. Throughout the evening, Margaret remained calm and attentive, asking simple questions and listening as the others spoke about work, family life, and the changing weather. At one point, little Lily ran into the room carrying a stuffed animal and proudly showed her grandmother the small playroom Emily had recently organized upstairs. Margaret followed her for a moment, smiling as the child explained where each toy belonged before returning to the dining area where dinner had been prepared. When the meal finished and the plates were slowly cleared from the table, the room grew quieter as conversations settled into smaller groups. Margaret noticed that most of the guests had gathered in the living room with coffee and dessert while Jason and Emily stood nearby, discussing future travel plans with two friends. Margaret reached calmly into her purse and removed the slim folder she had brought with her. She placed it gently on the dining table beside her cup. After a moment, she spoke Jason's name in the same calm tone she had used throughout the evening. Her voice was not loud, yet it carried clearly enough that both Jason and Emily turned toward her. Margaret smiled softly before sliding the folder across the table toward them. She explained that she had brought a few documents that clarified the financial help she had recently provided. Jason looked slightly confused but stepped closer, opening the folder while Emily leaned beside him to read the first page. The document was simple and professionally prepared, outlining the transfer of $180,000 as a structured family loan with clear repayment terms over time. Interest had been calculated modestly but fairly, and the agreement included a clause allowing Margaret to secure the balance against the property if payments were not made according to schedule. Margaret watched quietly while Jason read the page again more slowly. The room around them remained calm, filled with ordinary conversation from the living room, yet at the dining table a new understanding was beginning to settle. Margaret lifted her teacup and spoke gently, explaining that she believed clarity was the best way to protect relationships within a family. Her voice carried no anger, only calm certainty. For the first time that evening, Emily's confident smile faded slightly, while Jason continued studying the document with careful attention. And Margaret Whitmore sat patiently at the table, the same composed woman who had spent a lifetime understanding that sometimes the most powerful response was not raised voices, but quiet precision. Jason Whitmore stood quietly at the dining table with the folder still open in his hands, the soft sounds of conversation from the living room continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. For a moment he did not speak. His eyes moved slowly across the document again, reading each line more carefully the second time. Emily leaned closer beside him, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief as she realized the page was not simply a reminder or a casual note. It was a formal agreement, clearly written, carefully structured, and signed by Margaret Whitmore earlier that afternoon. The details were simple and precise. The transfer of $180,000 was recorded as a family loan, not a gift. The repayment schedule was calm and reasonable, spread across several years with modest interest that reflected the same responsibility Margaret had always shown in her own financial life. The clause regarding the property was written in clear language as well. If the loan remained unpaid after the agreed terms, Margaret would have the legal ability to secure the amount against the house Jason and Emily had purchased. Jason looked up slowly, his voice uncertain for the first time that evening. He asked Margaret when she had arranged this document. Margaret met his eyes with the same quiet composure she had carried all night. She explained gently that she had spoken with David Collins after realizing how important it was for families to keep financial matters clear. There was no accusation in her voice. She spoke the way someone might explain a practical household rule. Emily straightened beside Jason, crossing her arms lightly as she looked down at the page again. Her confident smile from earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. For several seconds, she said nothing. The room remained peaceful around them. In the living room, one of the guests laughed softly at a story being told near the fireplace. The quiet hum of normal life continued just a few steps away. Margaret lifted her teacup and took a small sip before speaking again. She said that helping Jason had always been important to her, and that nothing in the document changed her love for him or for her granddaughter. But she also believed that generosity worked best when everyone understood the responsibility that came with it. Jason closed the folder slowly and placed it back on the table. His shoulders relaxed slightly as the initial surprise faded into thoughtful silence. He knew his mother well enough to recognize the calm certainty behind her words. Margaret had never been dramatic, and she had never made decisions out of anger. When she took careful steps like this, it was because she had already thought through every detail. Emily finally spoke, her voice quieter now, asking whether Margaret truly expected them to repay the full amount. Margaret answered with a gentle smile that the terms were clearly written and fair to everyone involved. She reminded them that the schedule allowed plenty of time and that she trusted they would manage it responsibly. For a long moment, Jason looked from the document to his mother and then toward the driveway where the new vehicle rested beneath the porch light. Something thoughtful passed across his face, as if he was seeing the past few weeks from a different perspective. Margaret rose from the table and picked up her purse. She thanked them sincerely for the lovely dinner and told Jason to give Lily a hug before bedtime. As she walked toward the door, the warm lights of the house followed her into the quiet night outside. The air felt cool and calm as she stepped onto the driveway. Margaret Whitmore paused for a moment beside her car, looking back at the bright windows of her son's home. She did not feel angry. She did not feel vindicated. She simply felt balanced again, the way a person does after restoring order to something that had quietly slipped out of place. Then she opened the car door and drove home through the peaceful streets, leaving behind a house where everyone now understood something important about the quiet strength of the woman they had once mistaken for a burden.